There are certain ideas that sound harmless until they settle in. Ideas you don't remember agreeing to. Ideas you inherited so early that they never felt optional. They didn't arrive as beliefs, they arrived as facts, as how things are. And once they take hold, they quietly shape everything. How you see yourself, how you interpret events, how you decide what's possible and what isn't. Reality is full of those ideas, not lies in the dramatic sense. No villains, no conspiracy, just assumptions repeated so often they stopped being questioned. Assumptions that made the world feel stable, predictable, manageable, useful. But usefulness and truth are not the same thing. Most people go their entire lives without noticing that the way they experience reality isn't reality itself. It's a trained interface, a narrowed slice of something far more fluid, filtered through biology, memory, emotion, and habit. And because that interface works well enough, because it keeps things functioning, it's rarely examined. Until something cracks, a moment where the world feels off, too rigid, too repetitive, like you're living inside a loop you didn't consciously choose. Or a moment where something obvious suddenly stops making sense and you can't quite put it back the way it was before. That's usually when people start asking better questions. Not how do I fix my life, but what if the way I've been taught to experience reality is incomplete? This video is about 6 lies most people were taught about reality. Not to replace them with new beliefs, but to expose the assumptions underneath them. Because once you see those assumptions, you can't unsee them. And from that point on, reality doesn't feel dramatic or mystical. It feels different, clearer, stranger, less solid than you thought, and far more responsive than you were led to believe. Let's start with the first one. Number 1, you're seeing what's there. The first lie you were taught about reality is the most basic one. You were taught that you're seeing what's there. That when you open your eyes, you're looking out at a finished world. Objects already formed, space is already defined, a reality that exists independently, fully assembled, waiting for you to notice it. It feels obvious, it feels undeniable, and that's why it's so effective. What you experience as the world is not something you directly encounter. It's something your nervous system constructs. Light hits the retina, electrical signals fire, predictions are generated, corrections are applied, and a coherent scene is assembled, all in a fraction of a second. Fast enough that it feels immediate, fast enough that it feels like direct access. But it isn't. You have never experienced reality without interpretation. Not once. Every sight, every sound, every sensation you've ever known arrived already filtered, already stabilized, already shaped into something usable. You don't see the world, you see the version of it your nervous system knows how to render, and that version feels solid because it repeats. Stability is not evidence of truth, it's evidence of familiarity. Think about how quickly something unfamiliar becomes normal. A new environment feels strange at first, heightened, vivid, slightly disorienting. Then, without you noticing when it happens, it becomes ordinary. The walls don't change, the sounds don't change, your system does. It learns the pattern, reduces the alert signals, stops flagging novelty as important. Once that happens, the world feels solid again. This is where most people misunderstand what's happening. They assume solidity means accuracy, that because something feels stable, it must be objectively real in the way they're experiencing it. But solidity is just repetition happening fast enough to disappear from awareness. Your brain is not a passive receiver, it's a prediction machine. It doesn't wait to see what's there and then respond. It predicts what should be there and updates only when it has to. Most of what you perceive is expectation refined by habit, memory, emotion, and conditioning, which means that what feels like reality is often just familiarity doing its job. This isn't a flaw, it's a survival strategy. Your nervous system evolved to prioritize predictability over precision. A world that feels unstable or ambiguous is dangerous. So the brain learned to lock things down, to smooth uncertainty into certainty, to collapse variation into sameness, to present you with a world that feels consistent enough to navigate. Consistency keeps you alive. Accuracy is secondary. This is why two people can stand in the same room, hear the same words, experience the same event, and walk away with completely different realities. Not opinions, not interpretations, lived experiences that feel undeniably true to each of them. Because perception doesn't show you what is, it shows you what your system knows how to hold. And once a pattern stabilizes, it becomes invisible. You stop noticing that it's being constructed at all. The world just feels there, finished, given, obvious. That's the lie. Reality doesn't feel real because it's fixed. It feels real because it's familiar. And familiarity is persuasive. This matters more than it seems, because if what you experience is rendered rather than revealed, then change isn't about forcing new outcomes. It's about interrupting old renderings. It's about noticing the point where perception locks in and asking a question most people never ask. What am I assuming is already here? That question alone destabilizes the illusion of a finished world. And destabilization is where this work begins. Not with belief, not with control, not with manifesting anything, but with perception itself. Because once you see that what feels external and objective is constantly shaped by the system doing the perceiving, reality doesn't disappear, it becomes relational. Next, we're going to look at why that stabilization feels so convincing and why challenging it can feel unsettling even when nothing is actually wrong. Number 2, stability means accuracy. The second lie you were taught about reality is quieter than the first, but it's far more persuasive. You were taught that if something feels stable, it must be accurate. That consistency equals truth. That the parts of your life, your identity, and your experience that don't change very much are somehow more real than the parts that shift, fluctuate, or resist definition. This belief doesn't announce itself, it settles in slowly. It shows up as trust in what repeats and suspicion toward what feels uncertain. And because stability feels calming to the nervous system, it rarely gets questioned. It feels like common sense. But stability is not a measure of truth, it's a measure of repetition. Something becomes stable in your experience not because it's fundamentally accurate, but because your system has learned how to predict it efficiently. Once a pattern repeats enough times, the brain stops allocating energy to examining it closely. It smooths the edges, it fills in the gaps, it presents the experience as solid and reliable, even if the underlying conditions are anything but. This is how habits form. This is how identities form. This is how entire worldviews lock into place. Think about how a belief feels after you've held it for years. It doesn't feel like a belief anymore. It feels like reality itself, not because it's been verified over and over again, but because it's been rehearsed. The same interpretations applied to the same situations until they no longer register as interpretations at all. They just feel obvious. Your nervous system prefers what it can anticipate. Anticipation reduces metabolic cost. Predictability reduces uncertainty. And uncertainty, from the perspective of survival, is expensive. So the brain learns to reward familiarity with a sense of solidity and to flag novelty as discomfort, even when that novelty is more accurate than what it replaces. This is why change often feels wrong before it feels right. Not because it is wrong, but because it destabilizes a pattern your system has invested in maintaining. The discomfort isn't a signal that you're losing truth. It's a signal that you're losing efficiency. Something familiar is dissolving, and the nervous system doesn't like that, so it tightens its grip. This is where many people confuse resistance with intuition. They feel the discomfort of destabilization and assume it means danger, when in reality, it often means that a long-held rendering of reality is being challenged. And the system interprets that challenge as threat because it hasn't yet learned how to stabilize the new pattern. Stability, then, is not evidence of correctness, it's evidence of conditioning. Consider how emotional patterns work. If you've reacted to disappointment with withdrawal for long enough, withdrawal starts to feel like the appropriate response. Not because it's the only option, but because it's the one your system can execute without hesitation. It's stable, it's familiar, it feels grounded. But grounded doesn't mean accurate. The same is true at much larger scales. Cultural norms, social roles, narratives about success, failure, safety, and worth. These structures persist not because they reflect reality perfectly, but because they repeat consistently enough to feel unquestionable. Repetition creates realism. This is why a life can feel rigid even when nothing dramatic is wrong. Why people describe feeling stuck without being able to point to a clear cause. The world hasn't closed in on them. Their perception has stabilized around a limited range of possibilities, and everything outside that range now feels implausible, unrealistic, or unsafe. And because that limitation feels stable, it feels true. The nervous system doesn't ask, "Is this accurate?" It asks, "Is this predictable?" Once predictability is established, accuracy becomes irrelevant. This is not a failure of intelligence, it's a feature of biological systems. Stability conserves energy. It allows for faster responses. It reduces cognitive load. And in environments where survival is the primary concern, that trade-off makes sense. But when survival strategies are mistaken for truths about reality, something subtle happens. The range of what feels possible begins to shrink. Not because reality has narrowed, but because perception has settled into a groove deep enough to feel like bedrock. This is where people often get confused about change. They try to think their way out of patterns that are maintained at a much deeper level. They introduce new ideas while their nervous system is still committed to the old renderings. And when nothing shifts, they assume the ideas were wrong, rather than recognizing that stability was never about belief in the first place. It was about repetition. Accuracy doesn't announce itself with comfort. Very often, it arrives with a sense of unfamiliarity. It asks the system to reorient, to renegotiate predictions, to tolerate a period of uncertainty while new patterns stabilize. And until that happens, accuracy can feel disorganizing. This is why clarity is often resisted, not because it's false, but because it disrupts established coherence. Stability feels like ground under your feet. Accuracy feels like learning how to balance again. And this is the quiet danger of the second lie. If you trust stability as your guide to truth, you will instinctively defend whatever has repeated the longest, even when it no longer reflects what's actually happening. You will mistake comfort for correctness and familiarity for reality. Once you see this, you start to notice something important. The moments when reality feels most solid are often the moments when perception is doing the least amount of work. Everything has already been decided, interpreted, categorized, filed away. There is no openness left in the experience. And openness is where new information enters. This doesn't mean stability is bad. It means it's incomplete. It tells you what has worked before, not what is true now. And when stability is treated as truth, reality becomes rigid, not because it is rigid, but because perception has stopped updating. In the next movement, we're going to look at why this rigidity is so difficult to detect from the inside and how the brain itself contributes to maintaining it, not out of deception, but out of necessity. Because once you understand that, the idea of being misled starts to dissolve, and something more precise takes its place. Number 3, your brain shows you reality. The third lie you were taught about reality is subtle, and because it sounds reasonable, it's rarely examined. You were taught that your brain shows you reality. That perception is essentially a reporting function. Information comes in, the brain processes it, and what emerges is a reasonably faithful picture of what's happening around you. Maybe not perfect, but close enough to trust? This assumption feels modest. It doesn't claim omniscience, it allows for error while still preserving the idea that perception is fundamentally oriented toward truth. But the brain was never designed to show you reality. It was designed to keep you alive. Those two goals overlap just enough to feel identical, but they are not the same. Survival requires speed, efficiency, and prediction. Reality, on the other hand, is complex, ambiguous, and often slow to reveal itself. So the brain makes a trade. It sacrifices completeness for usefulness. It gives you a version of the world that is actionable, not accurate. This distinction matters more than most people realize. Your brain does not begin with observation and then form conclusions. It begins with expectation. Based on past experience, emotional memory, and biological priorities, it generates a prediction about what should be happening. Sensory input is then compared against that prediction, and only significant mismatches are flagged for attention. Most of what you experience never passes through conscious awareness at all. It's filtered out, filled in, or smoothed over before you ever notice it. What reaches you feels like direct perception, but it's already been edited. This is why perception feels effortless. Effortlessness is the sign that prediction is working. The brain becomes most noticeable, not when it's accurate, but when it's wrong. When something unexpected happens, when a sound doesn't match its source, when a familiar person behaves out of character, when a situation violates the model the system was using to navigate it. Only then does perception feel unstable. And because instability feels unpleasant, the system works quickly to restore coherence. It updates the model just enough to re-establish predictability, then returns to running quietly in the background. This is where the lie takes hold. Because perception feels seamless, we assume it's transparent. Because it feels immediate, we assume it's direct. But what feels like clarity is often just the absence of contradiction. Your brain isn't showing you reality, it's showing you the version of reality that creates the least friction for your nervous system. This doesn't mean the brain is lying in a moral sense. There is no intent to deceive, it's doing exactly what it evolved to do. It compresses complexity into something manageable. It prioritizes threats, ignores irrelevancies, and maintains continuity even when the underlying conditions are constantly shifting. Continuity is calming, ambiguity is not. So ambiguity gets reduced. Over time, this reduction becomes invisible. You stop noticing how much is missing because the system has learned to make the gaps feel natural. You don't feel like you're missing information. You feel like you're seeing reality clearly. This is why deeply held beliefs feel self-evident. Not because they're correct, but because the brain has organized perception around them. It highlights confirming details and downplays conflicting ones. It reinforces coherence, not truth. And once coherence is established, it becomes self-protecting. Challenges to perception don't register as new information. They register as disruption. The system reacts not by asking, is this accurate? But by asking, does this threaten stability? If it does, resistance arises automatically. This is why people can be shown evidence and feel more certain of the opposite. The brain isn't evaluating truth claims in isolation. It's defending a perceptual structure that has kept the organism oriented and functional. This defense often masquerades as logic, but logic here is secondary. The primary driver is coherence. When coherence is threatened, the system tightens, it simplifies, it returns to familiar interpretations. And because those interpretations feel stable, they feel real. This is the quiet mechanism behind perceptual rigidity. It's not stubbornness, it's not ignorance. It's the nervous system preserving an internal map that has worked well enough to survive. The cost of this preservation is subtle but significant. Over time, the brain begins to mistake its map for the territory. The rendering becomes confused with reality itself. And because the rendering is internally consistent, it becomes difficult to detect from the inside. You don't notice the filter because you're looking through it. This is where many people misunderstand awakening or insight. They expect new information to feel expansive, enlightening, or uplifting, but often the first sensation is disorientation, a sense that something familiar has shifted slightly out of alignment. That sensation isn't confusion, it's the brain recognizing that its predictions no longer fit cleanly, and rather than celebrate that, the system often resists it. It tries to restore the old coherence, to explain the disruption away, to return to what felt solid. This is why clarity can feel threatening, not because it's false, but because it requires the brain to loosen its grip on certainty. Understanding this reframes a lot. It means that when your perception feels limited, it's not because you're failing to see reality, it's because your brain is doing its job too well. It's optimizing for survival in a context that no longer demands the same constraints. The brain is not an enemy to overcome, it's a system to be understood. Once you see that perception is filtered, predicted, and stabilized long before it reaches awareness, the idea of seeing reality as it is starts to change. It becomes less about removing distortion and more about noticing how distortion operates. And that noticing is not intellectual, it's experiential. It shows up as pauses, as moments where reaction slows just enough for interpretation to be seen forming, as brief gaps where you can feel the system choosing coherence over openness. Those gaps matter because they're the only place where perception can update. Number 4, you're choosing your experience. The fourth lie you were taught about reality is one that feels empowering on the surface, but quietly misleading underneath. You were taught that you are choosing your experience, that what you feel, how you respond, and the direction your life takes are the result of conscious decisions made moment by moment. That awareness leads and experience follows. This belief feels affirming. It gives a sense of agency. It suggests that if something repeats, it's because you're choosing it again, and if something feels stuck, it must be because you're failing to choose differently. But most experience is not chosen, it is replayed. What feels like choice is very often the execution of patterns that were set long before awareness arrived. Emotional responses fire, interpretations form, and behaviors unfold automatically, all before the conscious mind has time to intervene. By the time you feel like you've decided, the nervous system has already selected a familiar route. This is not a flaw in character, it's how biological systems work. Your nervous system learns through repetition. It encodes responses based on what has reduced threat, conserved energy, or restored equilibrium in the past. Once a response proves reliable, it becomes the default, not because it's optimal, but because it's efficient. Efficiency feels like inevitability. This is why people often say, "I don't know why I reacted that way," even though the reaction felt immediate and convincing at the time. The system didn't consult awareness, it recognized a pattern and executed a solution it already knew. And because the response was fast, it felt like reality. Over time, these automatic responses accumulate. Emotional reactions become emotional identities. Coping strategies harden into personality traits. What began as adaptive behavior in a specific context becomes a generalized way of relating to the world. This is how a person comes to believe they are anxious, withdrawn, defensive, or detached, rather than recognizing those states as learned responses that continue to fire because because they've never been interrupted. The lie is not that choice doesn't exist. The lie is that choice is happening where you think it is. Choice does not appear at the level of reaction. By the time reaction is present, the window has already closed. What you experience in those moments is momentum, not decision. A pattern completing itself. This is why trying to choose differently often fails. The instruction is delivered too late. Awareness speaks, but the nervous system has already moved. And when that happens repeatedly, people begin to doubt their agency. They assume they are weak, undisciplined, or incapable of change, when in reality they are trying to apply conscious intention to processes that operate below the threshold of thought. Understanding this changes the tone of the entire conversation around responsibility. It removes blame. If most experience is replayed rather than chosen, then suffering is not evidence of failure, it's evidence of conditioning. Patterns learned in one context continuing to run in another where they no longer serve. This doesn't mean you are powerless, it means power exists somewhere else. Choice appears not in reaction, but in awareness of reaction, in the moment when a response is noticed rather than embodied. That noticing creates a pause, and the pause is where the pattern can loosen. But that pause is fragile. It doesn't feel dramatic, it feels subtle, often uncomfortable, like hesitation without clear instruction. And because it lacks the certainty of habit, it's easy to miss or override. This is why people often return to familiar experiences even when they consciously want something different. Familiarity provides immediate coherence. The unknown requires tolerance for instability, and instability feels threatening to a nervous system trained to equate predictability with safety. This is where the idea of choosing your reality becomes misleading. It suggests that change happens through assertion, when in reality it happens through interruption, not by forcing a new outcome, but by creating enough space for a different response to emerge. Most people are not choosing their experience, they are participating in loops. Loops of interpretation, emotion, and reaction that reinforce themselves over time. Each repetition strengthens the pathway, making the next iteration feel more inevitable than the last. And because the loop feels seamless, it feels chosen, but choice doesn't feel seamless. Choice feels awkward. It introduces uncertainty where there was previously flow. It disrupts timing. It creates a sense of being slightly out of sync with oneself. And that sensation is often misinterpreted as wrongness when it is actually the nervous system recalibrating. This is why awareness is so often confused with control. Awareness does not dictate outcomes, it does not command the system to behave differently. What it does is illuminate the moment where a pattern becomes visible. And visibility weakens automaticity. That weakening is subtle at first. The old response may still fire, the emotion may still arise, the interpretation may still form, but something shifts. The experience is no longer total, it is observed rather than inhabited. And observation changes participation, not immediately, not dramatically, but gradually, reliably, and without force. This is where real agency begins, not in choosing what happens, but in choosing how fully a pattern is allowed to run without being seen. Once you understand this, a lot of pressure falls away. You stop demanding constant conscious control and start paying attention to where awareness can enter the process. You stop blaming yourself for automatic responses and start recognizing the conditions that allow them to loosen. And that recognition creates a different relationship with experience, one that is less about correction and more about understanding. Number 5, reality responds to wanting. The fifth lie you were taught about. Reality is one that sounds hopeful, even empowering, which is why it spreads so easily. You were taught that reality responds to wanting. That desire itself is the mechanism. If you focus clearly enough, intend strongly enough, or visualize vividly enough, reality will reorganize in response. That wanting is an active force, and that the intensity of that wanting determines the outcome. This idea is comforting because it places control in the mind. It suggests that if something isn't changing, the solution is simply to want it more clearly or more positively. And when it works occasionally, which it does, it reinforces the belief that desire is the lever. But wanting is not the signal reality responds to. Wanting is often a sign of instability. Desire arises when there is a perceived gap between what is happening and what the system expects or needs. It carries tension, it carries orientation toward an absence, and that orientation shapes experience in a very specific way. Your nervous system does not organize around what you want. It organizes around what it is already stabilizing. This is why wanting something intensely does not reliably produce it. The desire itself often reinforces the sense that the thing is not here. The system remains oriented toward lack, toward effort, toward future resolution. And because the nervous system prioritizes coherence, it tends to maintain the state it already knows how to hold. What gets stabilized is not the imagined outcome, but the emotional pattern accompanying the wanting. This is where many people misunderstand what is actually happening. When something does manifest, it rarely arrives during intense effort or fixation. It appears after a shift in state, after tension drops, after the system settles into a different pattern of expectation. The wanting fades and something else takes its place. That something else is coherence. Coherence is not excitement, it is not optimism, it is not positivity, it is the state of internal alignment where perception, emotion, and expectation are not pulling in different directions. The nervous system is not bracing, it is not scanning for absence, it is not rehearsing effort, it is simply organized. Reality responds to that organization, not because it is rewarding virtue or intention, but because coherent systems stabilize coherent experiences. The nervous system acts as a filter, amplifying what matches its current pattern and downplaying what does not. When the system is locked in tension, it notices tension. When it is locked in lack, it notices lack. When it is settled, it registers different possibilities. This is why two people can pursue the same outcome with the same strategies and experience completely different results, not because one wants it more, but because their internal patterns are different. One system is organized around strain and anticipation, the other around readiness and integration. This distinction is subtle, but it matters. Wanting feels active, but it is reactive. It arises in response to a perceived deficiency. Coherence feels passive, but it is generative. It reflects a system that is no longer oriented around what is missing. This is where the language around manifestation becomes misleading. It collapses a complex biological and perceptual process into a mental act. It suggests that thinking and feeling harder is the path forward, when in reality, change often requires less effort, not more. A softening of fixation, a release of urgency, a shift in how experience is being stabilized moment to moment. This does not mean desire is wrong. It means desire is not the mechanism. Desire points. It indicates direction, but it does not create structure. The structure is created by what the nervous system repeatedly expects, tolerates, and reinforces. This is why forced positivity fails. It introduces a layer of cognitive assertion without changing the underlying organization. The system continues to brace, but now it is bracing against itself. The result is exhaustion, not transformation. Coherence cannot be faked. It emerges when internal conflict reduces, when perception is not constantly negotiating between what is and what should be, when the system no longer needs to maintain tension to feel oriented. This is also why suppression doesn't work. Pushing away unwanted feelings does not stabilize a new experience. It simply adds another layer of resistance. The nervous system remains organized around avoidance, and avoidance continues to shape what is noticed and reinforced. Reality responds not to what you demand, but to what you are rehearsing. And rehearsal happens below the level of thought. It happens in how you interpret situations, in how quickly you tense, in what you expect before anything unfolds, in what feels familiar enough to register as possible. When people say they feel stuck despite wanting change, it is rarely because they lack clarity. It is because their system is stabilizing a pattern that makes change feel foreign. And foreign experiences do not easily enter a system organized around the familiar. Understanding this reframes effort. It shifts the focus from trying to impose outcomes to noticing how experience is being organized. It moves attention from desire to condition, from wanting to stabilization. And in that shift, something important becomes available. You stop chasing results and start paying attention to states, not emotional states in the simplistic sense, but organizational states. How tension, expectation, and interpretation are aligned or misaligned in real time. This is not about controlling reality. It is about meeting it differently. When coherence increases, the range of what can stabilize as experience expands. Not magically, not instantly, but measurably. The system becomes more flexible, it updates more easily, it allows new patterns to repeat long enough to become familiar. And familiarity, as you've seen, is what makes reality feel real. Number 6, clarity feels good. The 6th lie you were taught about reality is the one that catches people off guard the most. You were taught that clarity feels good, that when something true is seen, it arrives as relief, certainty, or even joy. That understanding brings comfort. That insight feels like resolution. Sometimes it does. But when clarity touches something fundamental, something structural, it rarely arrives that way. Very often, clarity feels unsettling. It carries a sense of exposure, a quiet disorientation. Not because something is wrong, but because something familiar has just lost its authority. A long-held assumption loosens, and the nervous system no longer knows exactly how to stand in relation to what's there. This is why genuine insight is so often resisted, not because it is false, but because it removes the ground the system was using to orient itself. When clarity arises, it doesn't add something new to reality. It takes something away, a filter, a distortion, a stabilizing belief that once made things feel manageable. And when that belief dissolves, the experience underneath can feel stark, even uncomfortable, until a new coherence forms. This is where many people misunderstand what is happening. They assume discomfort means confusion. They interpret unease as failure to integrate. They search for reassurance, for something that will restore the previous sense of certainty. But that certainty was built on a structure that no longer holds. Clarity doesn't soothe the nervous system immediately. It destabilizes it first. This is not a flaw in the process, it is the process. Every lie you've explored in this video points to the same underlying dynamic. Reality was presented to you as fixed, stable, and external because that version of reality was easier to navigate. It reduced uncertainty, it simplified choice, it allowed patterns to repeat without constant renegotiation. When those assumptions are questioned, the system loses its shortcuts. Perception slows, reactions hesitate, interpretation no longer feels automatic. And in that pause, clarity emerges not as an answer, but as openness. Openness feels risky to a system trained for survival. This is why clarity often arrives with fear rather than relief. The fear is not a signal that something bad is happening. It is a signal that the nervous system is no longer running on default settings. Defaults feel safe. Awareness does not. And yet, awareness is the only place where reality can update. Clarity is not a destination you reach and then rest inside. It is a transition point, a moment where old renderings loosen and new ones have not yet stabilized. The mind dislikes this state because it lacks closure. The nervous system dislikes it because it lacks predictability, but this state is where flexibility returns. It is where perception regains movement. Once you understand this, something subtle shifts in how you relate to discomfort. You stop treating it as an obstacle and start recognizing it as a sign of recalibration. Not all discomfort means growth, but clarity almost always disturbs something before it reorganizes. This is why people often try to rush insight into certainty. They name it, categorize it, turn it into a new belief. Not because the belief is necessary, but because certainty restores stability. But if certainty arrives too quickly, the opportunity is lost. Reality closes again. The system stabilizes prematurely around a new structure, and the deeper flexibility that clarity offered never fully integrates. Clarity does not ask you to replace one story with another. It asks you to tolerate not knowing long enough for perception itself to change. This is the part most people skip. They want understanding without instability, insight without reorganization, awakening without disorientation. And when those expectations aren't met, they assume something has gone wrong. Nothing has. The unease you feel when a lie dissolves is the space where reality becomes negotiable again, where patterns can loosen, where the range of what feels possible begins to widen, not because you are forcing change, but because perception is no longer locked. That widening does not feel dramatic. It feels like noticing your reactions form instead of being inside them, like sensing interpretation arise rather than being swallowed by it, like recognizing familiarity for what it is rather than mistaking it for truth. This is what clarity actually gives you, not certainty, capacity. And that capacity changes how reality is experienced without requiring effort or control. If you step back now and look at all 6 lies together, a single pattern emerges. You were not taught these things to deceive you. You were taught them to stabilize you, to make reality navigable, to make life survivable. And in many ways they worked. They created coherence. They allowed patterns to repeat. They reduced uncertainty. But coherence is not the same as truth, and repetition is not the same as reality. What you experience is not a finished world revealed to you. It is a world rendered through perception, stabilized by repetition, filtered by survival priorities, replayed through conditioning, organized by internal coherence, and resisted when clarity threatens to loosen its structure. None of that makes you powerless. It makes you participatory. You are not the author of reality, and you are not its victim. You are the interface through which it becomes experience, and the quality of that interface matters more than any outcome you chase. This is why presence changes things without trying to, why awareness alters experience without effort, why noticing how perception forms is more transformative than forcing perception to change. Reality does not respond to control. It responds to clarity. Not clarity as certainty, but clarity as openness, as the willingness to see without immediately stabilizing, to feel without immediately interpreting, to allow perception to update rather than rushing it back into familiarity. When you stop mistaking stability for truth, reality doesn't fall apart. It becomes responsive. And that responsiveness is not mystical, it is practical. It shows up as flexibility where there was rigidity, as choice where there was repetition, as movement where there was a loop. You don't need to replace the lies with new beliefs. You only need to see them clearly enough that they stop running unseen. Because once they're visible, they lose their authority. And what replaces them is not confusion. It's a quieter, steadier way of being in reality. one that doesn't need certainty to function and doesn't need control to feel grounded. If anything in this video unsettled you, that's not a problem to fix. It's a signal that perception is adjusting. Let it. Stay with it. You don't need to rush to understanding. Understanding will come on its own. Reality always does once you stop trying to hold it still.